Good morning and welcome back to Dr. Logic Awkwardly Does Logic. This is the first in a series of videos where I want to talk about translating, both from a predicate language back into English and from English into a predicate language, usually one that we define along the way. Now, as with any languages, if they are able to express the same sorts of things, if they're able to kind of encode the same sorts of meanings, it should be perfectly possible to translate from one to the other. However, because these are languages and languages have different expressibility and different ways of being able to say things, there will end up being things that you can say easily in English that are kind of not very not very obvious in the predicate language, and also things that are perfectly easy to write down in the predicate language where you might struggle a bit translating them back into English. So one of the things that I hope you see from these videos is kind of where the bounds are and where you have contexts where actually English is the best language to be representing these particular ideas, or we can make better distinctions in a predicate language than we can if we were just using a natural language. So we're going to start in this video looking at going from a predicate language back into English. And I'm going to talk about cases where you've been given a bunch of sentences in a particular language, and you already have sort of an intuitive, informal idea of what the predicate symbols and relation symbols stand for. Now, we haven't done like the formal definition of interpretation and truth yet, but we can still talk about kind of informal representations. For instance, the unary predicate C will stand for is a cat, or the unary predicate R will stand for is red. So we can do things like that. That is not really the difficult part. The propositional connectives are going to end up being exactly the same. Conjunction, disjunction, still inclusive, negation, all of that. So really the difficulty comes in how do we read the quantifiers? I've already kind of given you an idea just by having read some of the sentences off in previous videos. I've said things like, for every X there is a Y, such, 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 such. Those are not very idiomatic. They are perfectly legitimate ways of reading the sentences, but if we are actually trying to get something back into meaningful English, this isn't how we generally talk in English. So generally, the upside down A, it's our universal quantifier. It's the thing that talks about everything. So the sorts of words that we use in English to indicate these same concepts, we've already seen when we were doing categorical propositions. Every, any, all, not some. So you can get kind of the negative quantifiers in as well. The existential one, of course, you can say, some cat is a mammal. Well, of course, but all cats are. How about some mammal is a cat? But you can also say things like there is a book on this table. There exists somewhere, don't necessarily know where. I don't know. Insert whatever you want there. So there are different ways that you can express the existential quantifier. And with this comes a lot of interesting philosophical questions on whether the existential quantifier in logic is existentially loaded, or whether you can talk about things that maybe don't necessarily exist using the existential quantifier. These are all interesting questions, but they aren't actually questions of logic. So we are setting them aside, and maybe some year down the line, I'll do a video on that. But it's not necessary for this particular use case right now. What we want is to be able to make a distinction between saying something universal and saying something about some particular individual or group of individuals. But we also want to be able to make a distinction between sentences that have explicit quantifiers and ones that don't. So you can have just variables which do not pick out specific things in the way that constants do, but where we still want to be able to say things about it. So these are best rendered in English using indefinite constructions or just using thing. So instead of saying like something runs, you would just say a thing runs. So these are the sorts of things where it's not necessarily as easy to make these distinctions in English as you can in the predicate language, which is of course one reason why predicate logic is useful. It allows us to be more precise about different things. Anyway, I have already put up a bunch of sentences on the whiteboard, and let's just kind of talk through them. Suppose that we have a predicate language where did I put my pen? Just very intuitively, P stands for is a pear, F is a fruit, T is a table. So all of those are unary predicates. And then we're also going to have one binary relation, is on. So, oh wait, I also have R for is red. So intuitively speaking, we can kind of represent the different things that we can say with a language like this. Includes something like a thing is a pair. So PX. So we're not talking about something or everything. We're just talking about X, which is an arbitrary thing. We can also say in the next case that a thing is a pair and is red, because this is the same X. And this is very important because anytime that you have a variable, it will always pick out the same thing. Anytime that you have two distinct variables, it doesn't necessarily mean they pick out distinct things. You need to be able to say more than that. I've got some examples of that later on, but let's look at number 3. This one, we've got the existential quantifier. This one says something is a pear and is red, or slightly more idiomatically in English, there is a red pear. Number 4, there is a table. But this is different from number 5, where we've lost the existential quantifier again, and we're back to a thing is a table and a thing is a pear. Now, nothing in number 5 says that the table and pear are distinct. This is something that we often bring with our understanding of how the English language works, but it's not in the predicate formula. You get it in 6, though. Here we say a thing is a table, a thing is a pear, but the pear and the table thing are not the same thing. So we've got this added statement of non-identity. And then we can also say much more complex things. We can say that, well, there is an X and there is a Y, and the X is a table and the Y is a pear, and the Y is on the X. So that's kind of a first pass of reading the predicate language and putting in some of the informal translations. And then we can go one more step and get a nice English sentence that simply says, there is a pear on some table. We can also make the distinction between saying that something is a fruit in Formula 8, or everything is a fruit in Formula 9. Of course, these are not going to have the same truth conditions. The first one is intuitively true, the second one intuitively false. But if we're only talking about fruit baskets, maybe number 9 would become true. And then we've got some interesting ones involving and the universal implication over complex formulas. Now, in categorical logic, we were able to say things like, all cats are mammals. Now, we don't have this sort of predicative structure in the way that we write down predicate language in the terms of writing down predicate language sentences. If we have something like everything is a fruit, we can do that. But the way that you would say something like every cat is a fruit, or everything is a mammal versus every cat is a mammal, is with an implication. So this says everything, if it is a pear, then it is a fruit. Or more idiomatically, we can just say all pears are fruit. Equivalently, because this internal, this formula in the parentheses is equivalent to this one, we could say everything is either not a pear or is a fruit. And this is not the same thing as saying everything is neither a pear nor a fruit. So the scope of this negation makes a difference. And then finally, the last thing to point out is that the order of the inputs to your binary relations also matters. There is a difference between saying in number 7 that there is a pear sitting on the table, and here where we say there's a table sitting on the pear. So it's one of the things where you might think, well, of course, order matters, but sometimes it's useful to have a specific example explaining, kind of illustrating exactly why. So here's just some examples. What you, in general, when you are trying to represent idiomatic English, you will have a two-part process. One where you kind of read the literal meaning of the predicate language off, kind of sticking in the intuitive and informal interpretations of the predicates and the relations. And then another step of turning this into a nice English sentence. A lot of times when we don't necessarily have this informal account, we will just read the predicate statements straight off at face value. So another way to read this in English is there is an X and there is a Y, TX and PY and OXY. So that is how I will often speak about these formulas in videos. And this is a perfectly legitimate way of reading them. It's just that sometimes you will be in a situation where you want to kind of get all the way back into English and not be talking about X's and Y's and things. So there you have it. In the next video, we'll start talking about going the other direction. So starting from English language sentences, constructing a predicate language, and then translating into it. So I look forward to seeing you then. Cheers.